We got ourselves a commissioner takeover, and on this week's episode, it's all about making fantasy rugby in the MLR even better. The Fantasy Ruckers Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 28 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along on this fantasy rugby journey of trying to make it a reality in the MLR. With you, as always, I am Ryan Yee, and you're gonna be missing a couple faces here if you're looking and watching on the YouTube channel. We're missing Matt and we're missing Devin, but that's okay. Like I said at the top of the show, it is a commissioner takeover on this week's episode. We're going to go through all the nitty gritty of the fantasy rugby operations in this past year and try to figure out how we can fine tune some things up here and make it even better in seasons to come, and hopefully many seasons to come, as like I said, we try to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. I'm sure Matt Yee and Devin Vanderpool will be back next week to join us to continue our off-season deep dive. Last week we had our first fantasy rugby deep dive where we really delved into the stats, at least the very preliminary stats of last season. We talked about fantasy lineup structures and kind of the best positions to play in that flex spot to give you an advantage. So if you missed that, you can check that out on last week's episode. Matt and myself were able to really get into the numbers there. So that was a really interesting conversation that we were able to have, and that deep dive into all those numbers and all those fantasy rugby numbers are going to continue throughout this offseason. Man, the fantasy rugby content doesn't stop. It might be the MLR off season, but we're going to try to keep it coming for you guys. And just like all fantasy sports, the preparation can't start early enough for the next season. So it might be still 2022. We might be just under a year away from the opening of the 2023 MLR season. But hey, like we spoke with a bunch of our league members throughout this season, you can never take enough fantasy rugby notes. You can never have enough stickies with all those little fantasy rugby tips that you remember throughout the year. We know John in the Fantasy Ruckers League, he's a big fan of those stickies, and I know Vandy and Matt may try to adapt and take that strategy moving forward, because I don't think there was much note-taking for them last season with the way that they finished in 2022. But I can't harp on them too much because they're not here to defend themselves. So we'll wait till next week's episode to really make sure we get back on them. But it'll just be 1 week away, and you guys won't miss them too much, hopefully. But yeah, on this week's episode, we're going to talk about just making fantasy rugby better. That has been my goal since the beginning. Since we started this project, it was all about trying to really make fantasy rugby a thing that people could have fun with, just another element to digest the sport, especially with the way that the game is growing here in North America. I think a fantasy element can only add to that, and I think after our first season in the 2022 MLR season, our inaugural season where we handed out our jersey here to John, who won our very first inaugural season of the Fantasy Ruckers League. So clearly there was something done right that we were able to get through the season, but there's always a little bit of fine tuning that you can do in order to make it even better. I think we have a long road ahead of us in terms of making fantasy rugby a real thing that people, not just in our Fantasy Ruckers League, that we're able to enjoy, but hopefully expand this out to many more people in the near future. And that's going to start with fine-tuning some of these roles and rules in terms of making it something that it is the most fun possible with the resources we have. And you'll understand what I mean by the resources that we have in just a few moments here. But we're going to open up the show like we always do. If you aren't following us yet, make sure you are on all the social media channels at the Fantasy Ruckers. We're also on YouTube. You can find us there as well, where we post a video portion of this podcast on the YouTube channel there. And hey, if you want to get in on the fantasy rugby conversation, you can always leave a comment on our YouTube page or on our socials as well. Get that fantasy rugby conversation spurring. And we also have a Discord channel though as well, and it's been very active in terms of the people that want to discuss rugby, discuss fantasy rugby. So if you aren't having enough of that conversation as part of your daily routine here, make sure you go out and join the Fantasy Ruckers Discord page. The link is down below in the description, and you'll be able to find all that good stuff. So with that out of the way, we got to open up the show like we always do with our Ask the Fantasy Ruckers Show question. And we can we always peruse through the social media channels in terms of who is tagging us there with the hashtag AskTFR Show hashtag, and then from there we get to pull out some of these questions. But this week we had a very specific question, and because this is a commissioner takeover show, we thought it would be a interesting question to open up with. What was the best part about being the commissioner or being the commissioner of a fantasy league? More specifically, what was it like being the fantasy commissioner of this very first season of this Fantasy Ruckers League, the very first way that fantasy rugby in this way has been implemented into some sort of rugby league, in this case, the MLR. And let me just go by answering the question, I love being a commissioner of leagues. I'm not only the commissioner of a league, I'm sure you've heard in previous episodes before, especially with Vandy, him and I are involved in other fantasy sports, including fantasy football, where we have a long-running fantasy football league that I am, yes, of course, commissioner of. And that just goes to my point about me, how much I love being the commissioner. Really, for me, it's the payoff of the enjoyment that league members get out of little things, not the big things, because maybe not so much in fantasy rugby, but when it comes to fantasy football and other fantasy sports that are already established, the framework is already there for you on all the apps and everything. So being a commissioner, you can really get away with doing the bare minimum, but I love doing the little bit extra, adding prizes, adding a trophy to obviously add a little bit more bragging rights to the season, something that we've added in our other fantasy leagues, and obviously something that we've added here with our Fantasy Ruckers League jersey. If you see on the YouTube channel, if you're watching on the YouTube video, the Barbarians jersey that has John's names etched as the inaugural season championship winner, things like that, right? It makes the league more fun. It gets league members involved. In our league here in the Fantasy Ruckers League, we do those weekly posts. We have this podcast that league members can listen to. This is the type of stuff that I love doing because it makes league members buy that much more into the league. And for league members, at least in the Fantasy Ruckers League, who are already passionate about rugby, and now I hope passionate somewhat about fantasy rugby, despite some of the heartache that it may cause on a week-to-week basis when we are in season, it just makes it that much more fun to have passionate fans buy into this thing even more. So that's from the overarching fantasy commissioner perspective. But specifically for the Fantasy Ruckers League, I think what was so enjoyable about this season was we didn't have that framework, right? We didn't have that app that we could rely on to provide us with, the structure and doing that scoring for us, because on many apps, fantasy apps particularly, the framework is there. Like I said, all the scoring is done automated for you. The pickups are done automated. Everything's done. And obviously with the resources that we've had for fantasy rugby and implementing this thing, and this past year just being kind of a test thing and a league that we're just going to see how fantasy rugby would operate in the MLR. And mind you, it was pretty successful, I must say. It was cool to not have that framework, despite all the hard work and the long hours that it did take to literally manually hand stat all these games and translate them into fantasy points and do all those things and then post them for the league members. It took a lot. It took a lot of time and a lot of resources, at least manpower resources, to really get this going. But what was so fun about the journey and the process on a week-to-week basis of going through those stats and jotting down those numbers and really hashing it all out is, aside from really being able to deep dive into Major League Rugby, which I don't think prior to the season I hadn't been been in as much depth into the league and been as invested into the league like I had this past season, because of all the stats and stuff that I needed to do with this Fantasy Ruckers League. But what it allowed me and what it gave me the insight into was kind of the way that our league members were kind of thinking, their mindsets going into the season. And what was so intriguing and interesting was the fact that, and we mentioned this on episodes before, is that this league, Fantasy Rugby or Fantasy MLR, there was no strategy going into this season. There was no framework. There was no blueprint for how people were going to be successful at this whole thing. The way that someone is successful at fantasy football, fantasy hockey, fantasy baseball, fantasy basketball, what have you. That strategy is not going to work in fantasy rugby, and I think a lot of people, especially the people in our league, figure that out pretty quickly. And maybe the strategy strategies that they came into this season going with weren't the strategies that they were finishing off with. And I think as commissioner, seeing the pickups behind the scenes, seeing the way that points were scored, seeing the lineups on a weekly basis, you could kind of see that dynamic change amongst each league member. So to me, that was very intriguing, on top of, like I said, all the other little bits that we added into our league to make it a little bit more fun, like the jersey, like the weekly post, like this podcast. Get a hop on with Matt and Vandy every single week and talk a little bit about rugby. Can't complain about that. But just seeing that extra passion and people investing into that, and also kind of the mindset and the growth of fantasy rugby in just a year's time, and not only the growth of fantasy rugby itself, which we'll get into in just a moment's time here, but also just the growth of our league members and how that is going to affect them moving forward. We mentioned it last episode. How are the strategies going to change? How are the numbers from the 2022 season going to alter the mindset of the way people and league members and fantasy rugby managers, of people in the Fantasy Ruckers League? And hopefully when we expand this thing to many more league members, how are people going to be looking at it differently, especially now that we have a season under our books? So I think that dynamic change over the entirety of the season, and even during the Fantasy Ruckers Playoff Challenge as well, seeing people that hadn't been in our Fantasy Ruckers League to have that year experience or that season experience to really get into fantasy rugby. They were implementing strategies that they thought would work, and whether it did or not remained to be seen when those results were released. But clearly some people are onto the correct strategy. I mean, we talk about John. I think I've given way too many shout outs on this episode already, but that guy kind of deserves it because he won not only our Fantasy Ruckers League, but he also took home the Fantasy Ruckers Playoff Challenge. So obviously his strategy clearly seems to be working. And I mean, hey, Matt was able to jump up all the way into second in the Fantasy Ruckers Playoff Challenge. So clearly his strategy, the strategy that he used to finish second last, or at the bottom of the heap in our Fantasy Ruckers Fantasy Ruckers League, clearly altered when he implemented something different into the Fantasy Ruckers Playoff Challenge. So yeah, I think that was the best part about being commissioner, getting to talk to all our league members on a regular basis, get to do this podcast, talk a little bit about rugby, but fantasy rugby specifically with Matt and Devin, and obviously you guys. It's been a lot of fun so far, so hopefully we can keep this thing going. And like I said, and our mantra here, I'm sure you've heard it a million times here on the Fantasy Ruckers Show, we're just trying to make it a reality in the MLR, and I think we're a step closer, at least after that 2022 season, to getting there. So hopefully we can get even a step closer after this off season, and once we get into our second Fantasy Ruckers League season in 2023. So yeah, really fun question there. If you have a question that you want to ask us, learn a little bit more about fantasy rugby in the MLR, or fantasy rugby in general, hit us up on social media. Use the hashtag AskTFR Show. We always keep an eye out for the people that are trying to reach us out through there. And if you got a pressing question that you'd like us to answer, do indeed go on social media and submit that, because we will definitely see it, and we'll hope to feature that on episodes to come. So now, with that being said, like I said, let's move on here to a little bit of news and notes. A few things have dropped since the last time that we've had an episode over the past week. Obviously, we mentioned it last episode. We mentioned it on episodes before. A lot of roster movement happening now during this MLR offseason, and a lot of that, I should say, is overseas guys kind of going back home to play for home clubs. And my expectation would be that those players would then return once the MLR season starts to kick back up, back to their home squads. There are a few players I'm going to mention here that I do believe fall under that sort of category. And then, hey, we also got guys that are moving on to bigger and better clubs, bigger and better leagues. That's exactly what you want to see. You want to see Major League Rugby being a place where players can go to develop their skills, and really develop their professional rugby resumes, and then move on to bigger and better leagues, because especially if they're homegrown guys from the US, guys from Canada that are moving on to top leagues around the world, Super Rugby, Top 14, Premiership, etc., that's exactly what you want to see, because that development, moving to those more established leagues, obviously, we don't need to beat around the bush. Obviously, those leagues are a higher talent than the MLR, but that's not the point. The point is that we're using the MLR as a stepping stone to develop that homegrown talent. So hopefully we won't have situations where the US Eagles are losing to Chile and now have to play in a repechage to book their ticket to the 2023 World Cup. So hopefully this kind of movement, the roster moves, moving on to bigger and better leagues is going to be a thing that we can continue to see, because I think it's a good sign that the MLR is developing players that are worthy of even better sides and leagues in the rugby world across the globe. So let me just mention some of those names. The names that I just want to rattle off quickly here. AJ Alatimu, he's going over to Counties Manukau. I hope I'm saying that right. The Samoan is going to go back to New Zealand and play a little bit of rugby over there. I expect this is one of those moves where he's going to get a little bit of off-season rugby and coming back once the Seawolves start to pick their season back up. I would expect AJ Alatimu to be a vital role of that Seawolves roster in 2023, and also a big indicator for all of you who are maybe not as in tune to how rugby roster moves operate. Firstly, this is a typical thing. A lot of players do, even in Super Rugby, even in more higher leagues. A lot of players do in their off season go back to their home clubs, their other clubs during the off season to kind of keep that rugby training level up, earn a little bit more money. Something that Matt mentioned last week, and it's something that isn't out of the norm. It's maybe something out of the norm that we don't typically see in North American sports, but it is definitely something that we do see in rugby quite frequently. And then to my point being is that I think a good indicator on whether or not some of these players are actually going to be moving on from their respective teams is, hey, look out on these MLR team social pages, because usually once we have a player that we know is going to be moving on and, will be moving on to a different league and will not be returning, we usually see that sort of, goodbye post from these teams. So haven't seen one for AJ Alatimu. Thomas Aoki of San Diego Legion, he's going to Auckland Rugby to play during the offseason. Again, haven't seen a post about it. He's a homegrown New Zealander, so I assume that this can only mean that he's going back to play a little bit of rugby back in his home country during the offseason. And then Isaac Salmon, he's going to the Tasman Rugby Union, the Tasman Makos. He played for the Toronto Arrows this past season. He's going back to New Zealand, again, his home country, to get a little bit of off-season reps in. Again, haven't seen a post about him leaving, so I expect in 2023 that he would be back in a Toronto Arrows jersey. The one player, though, this past week that did make a roster move that will not be returning to the MLR, though, is Cam Dodson from the Austin Gilgronis. He will be making a return to his home nation, England, to suit up for the Wasps. He will be joining the Wasps in the Premiership. His teammate on the Gilgronis, Sebastian de Chavez, he spent some time with the Wasps. So, hey, maybe a little bit of connection there. Hooked him up with a job overseas. Not too sure there. But nonetheless, the 25-year-old lock departs after playing 2 seasons with the Gilgronis. He's going to suit up with the Wasps. He said on social media, it was an absolute pleasure to call Austin home for the past 2 years. He's excited for the challenge ahead. Thanking everyone in Texas for his great experience. And yeah, so he'll be moving on. Again, like we see, a goodbye post moving on. Cam Dodson, not so much of a guy that necessarily was a huge fantasy contributor this season. 297th overall out of a total of, I believe, 527 players. So not that much of a fantasy contributor, only racked up about 4.5 fantasy points through the entirety of the season. Wasn't drafted at all. Don't think I saw him on fantasy rosters that frequently during this year, obviously, with that only 4.5 fantasy points racked up. But hey, Cam Dodson moving on. And like I mentioned before, good to see players who, develop in the MLR move on to higher and better leagues, because that is an indicator that the talent level of the MLR is only catching up to some of these bigger leagues. Not saying that it ever will catch up to these bigger leagues overseas, but at least if we can, tighten that gap a little bit, it will not only, like I've been hammering home, develop homegrown talent here. In Cam Dodson's case, obviously he's not from the US or Canada, he's from England, but there is the potential for someone from Canada or from the US to really develop and move on, like we've seen before in a lot of other players. We've seen Bodine Waka move on to Japan. Lots of opportunities here for homegrown talent to move on. And yeah, like I said, big indicator. And that's all we can ask for. And as the talent level moves up in this league, we get more players kind of tightening that gap. Like I mentioned, it's only going to be even more better for us. The product on TV is only going to get better. The excitement of watching these games is only going to get a lot more fun. So good to see a lot of these players moving on to bigger and better teams. And I'm sure we're going to get many more of that going on. But through a fantasy rugby lens, at least, we mentioned it last week, just be wary, right? Obviously, it's still very, very early, but it's going to be interesting to see kind of the news and notes that we get as we approach closer to the draft for the 2023 MLR season. Obviously, that's not going to happen until next year. But just keep an eye on where these players are moving. Because, hey, if a guy like Bodine Waka, who I would have assumed would have been the number one pick in the 2023 Fantasy MLR draft, he's not going to be around anymore, at least that as we know of right now. He's going overseas to Japan. That's going to have a big effect. So you're going to want to keep an eye out for some of these notable players moving on to better leagues, because you don't want to be caught in a position where you were depending on a guy, at least from a strategy perspective, that you were hoping to draft, and he ends up not even being in the MLR. So I think that's an element that a lot of fantasy managers for Fantasy MLR are going to have to keep an eye on, something that isn't familiar or isn't something that usually happens in other fantasy sports, especially in the major sports across North America. Last news and note, or a couple, I should say, news and notes that I also want to mention here. We missed some pretty big head coach hirings, or I should say a head coach and a front office hiring this past week. The Utah Warriors, and I hate that Vandy isn't on the show right now to kind of pump this guy up. Not that he knew anything about this incoming head coach, but you can only imagine that Vandy would be all aboard on whoever was coming in, and you know that guy. He's going to pump his Utah Warriors up, because you can expect that he is expecting a championship in 2023 for his Utah Warriors team, after, I would say, somewhat of a disappointing season in 2022 for the Utah Warriors. But yeah, Greg Cooper is now hired as the head coach for the Utah Warriors. He becomes the fourth head coach in Warriors franchise history. He joins the Utah Warriors from the Mitsubishi Dynaboars. What an awesome name, the Mitsubishi Dynaboars. I wish we had some creative naming in the MLR just like that. But yeah, they're from the Japanese league. He played in he coached in Japan Rugby League 1. It was the first time doing that, or at least he helped the Dynaboars elevate themselves to Japan Rugby League 1, the very first time in their 12-year history. He also helped Stade Francais to a European Challenge Cup championship, their first ever in their history. He was also an assistant coach that was promoted to the head coach for that team in 2017. He served as the head coach to the New Zealand U21 team. So obviously the resume for Greg Cooper is there. And I think out of all of that, the thing that I'm most excited about for Greg Cooper is his ability, it seems like, to turn teams that have potential but haven't done it on paper yet, and to make it a reality, to bring some hardware home for the first time in these franchises' history. And I think that's something huge to be said, because, hey, Utah Warriors in a very similar situation. They have yet to win a championship in the MLR. And I think a lot of people would agree with me. A lot of people that are watching the MLRs, particularly the Utah Warriors, they have a very, very competitive side. And I don't think the way that they performed last season is indicative of the level that they can achieve on the rugby pitch. But maybe Greg Cooper is that guy that can elevate them to that spot. He was able to do that with the Mitsubishi Dynaboars, elevating them to Japan Rugby League 1. He was able to do that with Stade Francais for the European Rugby Challenge Cup. The question only remains is, can he do it with the Utah Warriors? And I think all the signs are pointing that yes, he can. Obviously is going to take some time, but hey, Greg Cooper is working with some pretty talented players on the Utah Warriors. Mike Teo, to name one of them. Just got a bunch of guys on there that I think if they're used the right way, they can really turn things around. We saw it happen with the Houston SaberCats in the 2021 season, going from a literally winless season to, mind you, some help with some complications that happened off the pitch, but hey, the Houston SaberCats ended up winning the Western Conference. So obviously quick turnarounds are possible in the MLR, and we can only hope and we can only assume that Greg Cooper will do his best to do that with the Utah Warriors. I'll probably assume that you get some stronger language and stronger hopes and stronger optimism from Vandy, but we'll have to wait till next week to hear that from him. Another front office move, or at least staff move, I should say, the Dallas Jackals, and I think this one's even more interesting than the Utah Warriors hired. The Dallas Jackals have named Santiago Sodini as their general manager. A lot of people who know him call him Santi. We'll call him Santi here on the show as well. So Santi is the new general manager for the Dallas Jackals. He is an Argentinian native. He has a long history in rugby. He was a player, a coach, administrator, obviously now front office, playing around the world, including Australia, Italy, and England. His first MLR experience came with the Rugby Atlanta in 2021, where he was the director of operations for rugby. So he has that, I guess, that competitive pedigree. He was a part of that team that made that run in 2021, losing that Rugby Atlanta side, losing to the LA Guiltinis. But I think out of the whole thing that is interesting about this signing is his roots and his affiliation, his connection with his home country of Argentina. Obviously, we know that Argentina has become a powerhouse in rugby. A lot of that has been thanks to their addition to the Rugby Championship, competing on a yearly basis with New Zealand, South Africa, and Australia. I think that has obviously gone a long way in terms of developing rugby within Argentina. But hey, the Dallas Jackals, we mentioned it on the show before. The Houston SaberCats are the Houston SaberBoks. They're clearly South Africa's team. New York, we know it. They're the old boys, New Zealand. The Guiltinis, they have a whole bunch of Australia players on there. And now Dallas, hey, maybe they can add some names to that roster. We talk about Conrado Rura. Maybe we can add some other Argentinians to the team there through the connection that Santi has with his home country. Hey, that's what I'm all for. And that's what's, I think, interesting about rugby in North America that makes it so different and starkly different from all the other major sports in North America is that, yes, we have this draft process in the MLR that kind of is the limiting similarity between these North American sports and the MLR, but we also have this aspect of growing your own talent and we see a bunch of these teams, creating these youth programs. They have their youth sides that are competing and really trying to find talent from within their own areas and locations to make contributions to their MLR team. And hey, who knows where you'll find, the next Bodine Walker, you'll find the next star of your rugby club. And I think that's something very different than the other North American sports because there's a lot more of a heavy reliance on the draft in hockey, in football, in baseball, in basketball and things like that, where we don't see that as heavy as a reliance. Obviously, some of that is due to some of the lackadaisical MLR draft rules. We saw it with some of the Gilgroni signings this past season, where some players waited for that eligibility to pass, where they can instead announce to be part of the draft. They could just sign freely with the team. But anyways, there are ways that teams can obviously grow their own talent and bring in talent outside of the draft. And we're mentioning and talking about some of this homegrown talent, but hey, who says you can't have a pipeline from a location outside of North America? And if the Dallas Jackals can create this pipeline through Santi, where they're bringing in Argentinian talent, hey, it's going to make the MLR a whole lot better. I know there's a lot of people out there that love to see just North American players really dominate here in the MLR. But to be honest, especially from a fantasy rugby perspective, I just want to see the product on the field get better and better. And if that means bringing players in overseas, hey, no one's complaining the fact that Nehe Milner-Scudder came over. No one's complaining about the fact that Waisake Nahal is coming out. I only saw huge hype and huge excitement around those guys coming. Hey, if we can bring in a couple bigger Argentinian names, add a little bit of South American culture to this league, a little bit more South American flair, I think it's going to be a whole lot of fun. And like I said, it's only going to elevate the competition level that is in the MLR. So I love to see that. And I think that's a huge signing for the Dallas Jackals, who obviously had a tough season. They'll look to do what the Houston SaberCats were able to do in 2021. But I think it all starts from the top here. Obviously, what the Dallas Jackals were dealing with the season before, a lot of, things that they couldn't control, things that they could control. But at the end of the day, I do think that this signing is a point in the right direction. So we'll see what Santiago Sodini will be able to do as general manager for the Dallas Jackals. And then last thing here, guys, and this is only speculation. I do want to mention it every single show because I want to remind our listeners and viewers that we are keeping an eye on this, because I do not want this to go away, because we do need to hold the people that are making these decisions accountable, especially when we want the MLR to grow the way we want it to grow and become an established professional league within North America, and just be a league that is recognizable and reputable in the rugby world across the globe. And I'm talking about the whole conundrum that is happening with the LA Giltinis and the Austin Gilgronis, the lawsuit that was happening with Adam Gilchrist. We mentioned last week that lawsuit, I believe, has since been dropped. Obviously, there's going to be settlements to be made outside of the courtroom between the MLR and Adam Gilchrist and his ownership group. But the only reason why I'm bringing this up is that there really hasn't been any new developments. But here at the Fantasy Ruckers, we are perusers of the Reddit community, and we did see a post on there, and I'm not sure how reliable it is, but I'm only going to use this kind of as a discussion point. And that is, someone has said that there is inklings that new ownership group that is coming in to buy the Gilgronis. We heard about those inklings midway through that 2022 season, last season, that the Gilgronis were up for sale, even to a point where ownership was, or a potential new ownership group was meeting with players and outlining their plan and what is to be expected ahead. There has been rumors that the new ownership group does not want to stay in Austin. And I don't know how to feel about it. I mean, we do have 3 teams in the Lone Star State already. We have Austin Gilgronis, we have the Houston SaberCats, and now, of course, we do have the Dallas Jackals. So I don't think at least the state of Texas is going to be missing anything. But the city of Austin, though, I can't imagine that there's many other places that are better than Austin to host an MLR team. I mean, we're talking about a city that is rapidly growing. It seemed to have a lot of fans come out to their matches. I mean, out of all of the games that I was watching on TV or on the Rugby Network, I had to say that Austin was always, at least on a weekly basis, one of the teams that seemed, I don't know from an exact number standpoint, but seemed to have a lot of fans there and a significant amount of fans. And I don't know if it was because it was a smaller venue and maybe seemed like it was more packed, but it did feel like Austin did have a big following, at least from the local community. So I'm not too sure what the kind of process and the thinking behind this is, but it is something that did pass by our newswire, and it was just something that we wanted to mention. Again, nothing that is concrete, nothing that has been verified, or nothing that has been sourced, but we just want to continue making sure that we're keeping everyone up to date with this situation of the Gilgronis, of the Giltinis, because I have a feeling something is going to happen, and we want to make sure that we're there when it does, because it's obviously going to have a ripple effect throughout the MLR and from a fantasy rugby perspective as well. So something that we'll keep an eye on. And then last thing here, and just quickly, we want to mention that the MLR draft is coming up, and actually from today on Wednesday, there is actually, I believe, 5 days left for players to declare for that MLR draft. So it'll be interesting to see kind of the names that do pop up here for the draft, and that draft is going to be broadcasted on Fox Sports 2 on August 18th at 6:30 Eastern time. So we'll be making sure, like we mentioned, trying to do something with that. But hey, the declaration deadline is coming up for some of the players who are aspiring to join the MLR. So we're going to keep an eye on some players, some key young players, maybe some future stars that will be part of the MLR in less than a month's time, who will be finding their team. So that's the news and notes portion of the show. Took a little bit longer there, but I do think that there were some important things to go over there, especially with those head coach hirings that I feel will definitely have an impact in the many seasons to come, especially from a fantasy perspective. All right, so now it's time to move on to the thing that a lot of you have been waiting for, and that is the plan here. The commissioner's plan to make fantasy rugby even better moving forward. And like I mentioned, that's always my goal. It's always to improve this thing. This is a project that we took on that we didn't know where it was going to go. We could not even imagine that it was going to be as good as it was in this past inaugural season. It only gives us more motivation to make this thing even better and even more fun to play. So with that, haven't heard this one in a while because we've been in off season, but we're going to break it all down in Commissioner Yee's League Update. Hear ye, hear ye. This is Commissioner Yee with the league update. And with this league update, man, I missed that drop. I haven't heard it since the season. I'm sure you guys missed it too. But hey, we're breaking down how we can make Fantasy MLR even better moving forward. And I broke it down into 3 sections here. We're going to be talking here about scoring format, lineup structure, and then we're going to just talk about some other, outline things that have come to mind that I think, is something to address or something to just bring up. And as I go through this, I want especially our league members and especially guys who are aspiring to join a fantasy MLR league, hopefully in the future, as we try to figure out a way that we can expand this thing to more people, to more leagues. If you have any thoughts or any ideas that you think after hearing this podcast or hearing and following our Fantasy Ruckers League, if you think there's anything that we can add that you feel would enhance the product, enhance Fantasy MLR, we are all ears. Because I think, like we mentioned all the episodes, I think we're all in this together in terms of trying to make this thing a reality in the MLR for anyone who is as passionate about fantasy sports as I am. I'm always looking for ways to kind of make it more dynamic and make it more interesting for league members, because at the end of the day, it's only going to make it more fun for you to play. We're all ears, so make sure to reach out to us at the Fantasy Ruckers or send us a direct message. Chat with us in the Discord channel. Any ideas that you have, we would love to hear it. And then another thing I want to mention is that as we start to go through this thing, I want all of our listeners and viewers to remember that a large portion of the way that this fantasy league or fantasy rugby, at least to this point, has been structured, has been limited by the resources that we have access to. I think we all know it's a big talking point in the MLR community is the access of stats. We're a season away. We've had discussions with the MLR All Access crew. They've told us that stats are coming in the near future. The MLR website has made somewhat of a improvement in terms of the stats that are available. But at least when it comes from stats that can be usable in a fantasy rugby perspective, we're not quite there yet. So a lot of these things that we are missing that would make this more fun is due to that reason. But we're going to do our best to find ways that we can still implement things like that until we are able to get those stats. And I will say, hopefully soon we'll be able to get those. We're going to do everything in our power to make something happen in terms of adding more enhanced MLR stats to fantasy rugby and just to everyone as a whole, because I think anyone who loves any league loves to kind of deep dive into if you're as crazy as me and love rugby as much as I do. I know there's a lot of people who love it even more. Love to go through the stats and just see how players are doing from a more analytical standpoint. So we hope to get that soon, and that will only make the fantasy rugby product better. So let's start here, guys, with the scoring format. And I think the biggest word and the biggest takeaway from this for me as a commissioner is volatility. That's the word that I'm taking away, because I think that the way, like I mentioned, the stats that we had available to us, plus the way that things were scored, it really lended itself to boom or bust weeks. And what I mean by that is that obviously, especially our league members know, is that a big portion of our Fantasy Ruckers League was try scoring. Try scoring was a big aspect of that. And essentially, if you had the team that scored the most tries, you were going to win your fantasy matchup that week. Not that that was a bad thing, not that that was a good thing, but that was just something that fantasy managers need to tailor their strategy towards. And I'm not too sure if that was necessarily something that was as top of mind at the start of the season, but it was definitely something, like I mentioned at the top of the show, in terms of the development and the change of mindset from league managers. That was definitely something that had a larger emphasis towards the end of the season. So my goal going forward with this is hopefully to remove some of that volatility. And the way that's going to happen is by adding more parameters in terms of ways we score certain things. And what I mean by that is adding more, things that we can track that can add to fantasy points. So like I said, and we've mentioned during the show, it would be a dream of mine to be able to add tackling. I mean, friend of the show, Mike Smith, would be a monster in Fantasy MLR if we had a tackle stat that could be tallied and translated into fantasy points, because I think that's something that can add. And I should mention the large understanding, or the large consensus about fantasy sports, not even just Fantasy MLR, is more points are better. When fantasy sports have more points, and I'm not talking about points that are scored on the field, but have more points in a matchup basis, fantasy managers are going to have more fun because they're following more things. Oh, I got a point there. Oh, I got a point there. That's what we want to do here. So we can add more things to our scoring system, like tackles, line breaks could be something else. I'm just thinking on the top of my head here, tackles, line breaks, line out wins, scrum steals, things like that, things that can just add and add to those points tallying. It's going to dilute the strength and the boom factor, for lack of better terms, that try scoring has, because it's not so heavy relying on picking up a front rower that is involved in all the set piece tries, because you're really banking on scoring those 5 points. You're also picking up guys that are big tackle machines. You're picking guys in the maybe not so much just second row guys that have a chance of scoring a try, but you're picking up guys that are able to tackle a lot or are involved in other aspects of the game. Those are the types of things that we want to add. So I think that is the general, where we are at now type deal, where we have a lot of volatility in the scoring. Not that it makes it any less fun, but it does. I can understand the frustration from a week-to-week basis for fantasy managers to kind of predict those types of things. And we also want to shift with that volatility. Obviously, a lot of fantasy in general is about luck, but I think in Fantasy MLR that we've established here as of right now, there's a lot more luck involved in the outcomes of our matchups than are in other fantasy sports. So we want to try to reduce that number, try to bring that down. I think part of that is diluting the try scoring impact that it's having on a week-to-week basis, and hopefully add other little elements. And I know that's something that we've been mentioning all year long. We've been mentioning it since the beginning that we started this thing. But hopefully, because we've seen MLR kind of advance the stats a little bit more, hopefully through conversations that we have, we can get access to more MLR stats and hopefully implement that maybe in the upcoming season, because that would be a dream of mine. And obviously, that would absolutely shake up the strategies involved in terms of picking guys, because you're now considering other strengths like tackling, like more set piece involvement, things like that. it's going to shift the landscape incredibly. But it is going to, at the end of the day, add a little bit more of a dynamic feel to Fantasy MLR instead of this kind of linear try scoring and kicking point scoring magnitude in terms of the impact that those two things have. And speaking of kicking, which was, I would say, outside of the try scoring, was probably the second most, if not the most on some weeks, the contributions that those had to the matchup point totals. And obviously a big part of that, especially if guys had multiple kickers, was predicting which kicker was going to go off, because that obviously wasn't something that was a shoo-in for league managers. But I do think that the kicking that we implemented this past season was very, very well done. I love the fact that heading into the season, we decided collectively as a league that we originally had it scored just as it was scored in rugby itself, 3 points for a penalty, 2 points for a conversion. But after some thinking, we realized, hey, 3 points is more than half worth of a try. I'm not too sure if we should be giving that to kickers. We diminished it by half, ended up going 1.5 points to penalties, 1 point to conversions, and it ended up being really, really good. Kickers were still very, very strong in our league, but I can only imagine how much more OP or overpowered kickers would have been in the Fantasy Ruckers League if we had left it at those 3 points and 2 points. Moving forward with the kicking thing, something that has been brought up in conversation is the idea that maybe we could implement kicker accuracy, because right now, what we did was we just did points total. We just did a rack 'em up type deal where if you got one in, you got points. Do we add an element of the accuracy of these kickers to make it more interesting? Do we consider, hey, you missed a kick, you missed a conversion kick, that's minus X points. So it has this kind of the tug and pull, push and pull type dynamic, where it isn't just kind of collectively adding points on the kicks you get. You're going to get penalized for missing kicks as well. Maybe you think that is too strict. Maybe you think that's too strong of a penalty. Maybe we start considering the distances at which these kickers kick. Maybe a base conversion is considered as 1 point, but for every meter that is kicked outside of the post, you add a certain element. Maybe if it's 10 meters outside of the post, it's an additional half point. Things like that, just to add a little bit more dynamic. Like I mentioned, or I should mention, that a thing like that, where measuring those meters is going to get a little bit tricky if we are working off of the stats that we're working off right now. But nonetheless, it would be very interesting to see if we can add kind of that push and pull element to kickers, where it isn't just make one or don't make one. It's either make one, you get rewarded, don't make one, you get penalized, or maybe it's make one, and depending on where that kick was made, you're going to get additional or less points. Maybe if it's just a meter outside the post, we dilute it and say, hey, that's only going to be worth half a point because it was such an easy kick to make, and maybe a point, maybe a kick right across the sideline is 1.5 points for a conversion. Something like that. So I'd love to get your thoughts. I'd love to get league members' thoughts. I'd love to get listeners' thoughts, because, hey, like I said, there may be an opportunity for you to join a league in the near future, and we want to get everyone who's interested in fantasy rugby get their input into this, because we want to get as many people involved, because usually that's how the best decisions are made. A consensus. We're a democracy here at the Fantasy Ruckers Show, so we'd love to hear what the people have to say. So that's about all that I had for the scoring format of it. Basically, kind of in summation, talking about kind of making scoring a little bit less volatile, finding ways to do that. So if any of you have any ideas on ways to do that with this current stats that we do have, obviously we mentioned tackling and other things like that are things that we could add, but as one person here to stat all that, it's a little bit unrealistic until we do get those stats from the MLR. So maybe if there's something in the meantime that you think of that doesn't require as heavy time resources in terms to stat out, I'd love to hear it. And then we mentioned kind of adding that dynamic play to the kicker role. That could be something as well. So any other ideas with scoring, love to hear it. Make sure you give us a message at the Fantasy Ruckers. Moving on to the lineup structure now. Not much to say about this because I was actually pretty happy with how the lineup structure turned out for our Fantasy Ruckers League. For those of you who are just tuning in for the first time, the way that we statted out the lineup structure, or the way that we came up with it, it was going to be one front row position, which can include either prop or hooker, a second row position, back row position, which could be either a flanker or an 8-man, a scrum half, a fly half, a center, which could be either obviously the inside or outside center, a back 3 player, which could range from any of the fullback to the winger, and then a back flex and a back forward, where any forward player or any back player can go into those respective positions. I loved the idea, and we got into more depth into it last week's episode, so you can check that out if you want to learn more about the back flex and forward flex positions. I love that aspect. That was probably the most dynamic aspect of our lineup structure. I love seeing how kind of people made those decisions, if they were going to put a front row there, a back row there, or if they were going to put a back 3 player there, or a fly half, or a scrum half, or a center. Just really, really interesting. Again, we went over that decision-making process in terms of the flex last episode, so go check that out. But just as a lineup structure as a whole, I really, really did like kind of the balance that we had. I thought that every single position made contributions. Every single position had their advantages, had their disadvantages. You really saw throughout the season kind of how team members kind of built that structure around that. We mentioned last week about kind of these positional advantages. Matt talked about the advantage of having a really good front row. Talk about, having that really, really good fly half that you could be dependent on, that you knew was going to kick, that you knew was going to be involved in the offense, that was going to be distributing, playmaking, racking up those assists, having those try-scoring opportunities, things like that. So I really did like how the lineup was structured. I thought that having, I guess it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 positions essentially on a weekly basis, and then 5 bench positions. I thought that was perfect, especially what this lineup structure is based on is the depth of the MLR. As the MLR grows, we can grow. As there's more dominant players, we can have add more players to the list. What we don't want in this league is to force league managers and force fantasy MLR managers to put in players that they really don't want to be putting in, right? We're talking about players that, they'll get an 80-minute here, they'll get an 80-minute there. You're just kind of, making, hoping for the best when you throw a guy in. We don't want that. We want guys and league managers to have confidence in their lineups. Obviously, that's going to change from a week-to-week basis, especially with the buys and things like that. But for a large portion of the part, we don't want managers to be unhappy with the guys that they're putting in, at least from a fantasy contribution standpoint. It's one thing if they don't perform, on a certain week. It's another thing that on a week in and week out basis, they're just not translating anything into fantasy. So we don't want to have to force players league managers to reach for that depth. So I think what we had here was perfect for that. What kind of coincides with that is the depth of our league. We only had 8 teams in our inaugural Fantasy Ruckers League. Again, a large portion of that is there's only 13 teams in the MLR. So, if you expanded that to 12 teams, right, in the Fantasy Ruckers League, every team is going to have to pick a scrum half because there's only one on every single weekly basis. And you can't say that every scrum half, we learned from last season, definitely every scrum half, the discrepancy between the top scrum half in the league, you're talking about the Harrison Goddards, you're talking about the JP Smiths, to the bottom kind of the scrum halves in the league who aren't as making as big contributions, or hey, maybe they're just subbing in for half or what have you. We don't want to have that. We don't want a guy to pick the bottom of the scraps of the scrum half position. So I think an 8-team league was kind of perfect for this. Again, if the MLR grows, we'll adapt with it. And I'd love to have more teams in these leagues because it only makes it more fun. You're going to have different matchups. You're going to meet more people. So I would love to have that. But I think with the current standing of the amount of teams that the MLR has, I think 8 is that kind of sweet spot with that. I'd love to hear everyone else's opinion with these lineup structures. This was one thing that I really thought was nailed on the head for us heading into the season, and I think it was a big portion of the success. If the lineup structure kind of faulted, I think we would have been in a pretty big issue there, and we may not have lasted the entirety of the season. But I think because we started off on a strong foot with that, I think it really set us up for success. So, hey, if any of you listening have any other different ideas about lineup structure, maybe, you'd like to see the front row position split into prop and hooker. Again, though, that limits us. There's only going to be 13 hookers on a weekly basis. So having 8 teams in a league, there's going to be some scraps that are involved. So I'd love to hear whether or not you guys would side with that, expanding some of these positions out, deepening the benches, adding teams, lessening teams. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then the final thing before we kind of wrap up this show here is just some kind of overlying thoughts that I had throughout the entirety of the season. I think this is where I got to give a shout out, like I've been giving all season long, to our league members in the inaugural Fantasy Ruckers League. I think with the manual labor that was involved, not even from my end, but just from the league as a whole, this league would not have been as successful as it was, like I mentioned, with the lineup structure, but also with the people that were involved and as invested as they were. So I think that fits nicely here in the other thoughts in terms of how the league operated. But just other little things. I thought the season was well played out. I thought the schedule was good. I thought it was crucial that we had our championship a week before the final week of the season, just because there was a lot of lineup moves there, a bunch of guys not starting. So just like fantasy football, I think it was good for us to make that decision in terms of having it a little bit earlier. I thought the way that pickups and I love the fab thing going. I thought all of that really worked well. So that was a key thing there as well. Setting up your lineups and then submitting those waiver claims. I thought that added just another element to it. My favorite part was me making the announcement of, who won this week's auction for the best guy. A thing that sticks with me is the Wasake Nahalo sweepstakes was when it was first announced that he was coming to town. People were going nuts with the amount of money that they were dropping. So kind of adds a game within the game, where obviously on the Sunday you're playing for those fantasy matchups, but hey, on Wednesday too, you're also sitting at the edge of your seat waiting to see how those roster moves are going to affect your fantasy MLR lineup. So I thought that was great as well. So I really can't say, like I said, I think these are just tidbits that I'm thinking out loud here, commissioner's thoughts, commissioner's notes, things that I just came up with as we went through the entirety of the season. But I think the big thing here, guys, is that I want to hear from all of you as commissioner of this very first Fantasy Rugby MLR League. I want to continue to make improvements. I want to continue to, make this thing as enjoyable as possible. And a large part of that is going to come from you guys, come from the league members, come from the listeners, and come from hopefully future league members on how they feel fantasy rugby should operate. Because like we said, this is a brand new thing and there's a lot of room for improvement even from our end. So we'd love to get your input into that. And like we mentioned, you can do that by hitting us up on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Leave a comment here or even join the Discord channel where we can have a real in-depth conversation about fantasy rugby, because we love chatting with you guys. It's been absolutely a blast all season long, and it will continue to be that as we continue to work through this thing. So it's been a lot of fun so far. So with that being said, those are kind of my thoughts. So I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about that. Got through all those news and notes. We're in the full swing of the MLR off season, but that doesn't mean that the fantasy rugby content is going to stop. Matt and Devin should be back next week, where we are going to dive into another fantasy deep dive stat. I'm gonna keep it under wraps here because I don't want to give too much away. But if you are someone that wants to get the extra leg up come 2023's MLR fantasy rugby season, you may want to tune in to episode 29. That will be happening next week, where the boys will be back in town. But with that being said, I am Ryan Yeem. Thank you so much to everyone listening. We'll be back next week for another edition of the Fantasy Ruckers Show.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.